Cool. So let's go ahead and get started here. I'll put, so hey everybody, I'm Dustin Loop, co-chair of the IGF-USA, and thank you for joining us for this IGF-USA preview event, the evolving role of the internet in our lives. And before we get into the heart of the discussion, I just want to run through a few logistical details. We have both the chat and the Q&A enabled. The chat is just intended to be used for interaction between the participants, including both co-chairs, myself and Melinda Clem, who is with us as well. And we'll be, interacting in the chat that way. And then the Q&A is intended for you to ask questions that you would like the speakers to answer. We're going to be taking questions intermittently throughout the presentation. So please ask the questions as they arise rather than waiting until we get to a period of pause for questions. Zoom has a new feature that enables you to upvote questions. And so we're going to be testing that out and utilizing that to try to identify the priority questions that we should address. We hope that we can get to all of them, but there is a lot to cover today, so we'll rely on that initially. And when we answer your question, we're going to enable you to talk and give you the opportunity to ask the question directly. When you're doing so, please introduce yourself, provide an affiliation, and ask the question that you have posed. And we'll be enforcing a 30-second time limit because we do have a lot of ground to cover here. So please adhere to that, and don't make us use the mute button. And so yeah, there's a lot of ground to cover here today, and we're going to get a great look into the research that's carried out by Pew Research Center over the past few months. There's an unprecedented focus on the role of the internet in our lives, with COVID-19 forcing most aspects of our lives online. And in the past months, we've seen large, sustained protests against systemic racism and injustice. And believe it or not, we are barely 4 months away from the 2020 election. And in the midst of all of this, we have legislation that has been introduced that is aimed at Section 230 and encryption, among other things. These are two topics that will be at the center of intense dialogue at the IGF-USA 2020, which is 2 weeks away. And that brings us to the purpose of today's event. The IGF-USA will be on July 22nd and 23rd, and it will be our first time having a fully virtual conference. So we are looking forward to seeing you all, regardless of where you are. And we're also joined today, like I mentioned, by IGF-USA co-chair Melinda Clem, who will be giving us an overview of what to expect at this year's event. But before we get to that, I want to introduce the real star of today's show, Rainie, the Director of Internet and Technology Research for Pew Research Center. Both Lee and Pew have made very important contributions to the IGF-USA over the years and the internet at large. And they do so by bringing their data and expertise to guide and moderate the discussions about the important issues that we face, such as the digital divide and techlash and other issues that we've covered in the past. But this year we didn't think that it was fair to limit Pew's input to one panel. So we decided to have this dedicated session to highlight their research, because they're covering so many different issues that we'll be talking about at the IGF-USA: the digital divide, privacy, education, telework, and just the numerous ways in which Americans have used and relied on the internet during the pandemic, protests, and in this year's election cycle. During Lee's time with Pew, the center has released over 650 reports, might be even higher now, based on its survey that examines people's online activity and the internet's role in their lives. I have the utmost respect for Lee and his team and the work they do over at Pew, and I think I speak for much of the community when I say that we are thrilled to have him with us today to help us navigate this complex landscape with research and data. So, Lee, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for being so nice to me. When Dustin and I were first talking about what we might have for the regular IGF meeting, and I started running through all the stuff we were doing, it seemed like having a sort of pre-conference rundown of the many things that I and my colleagues are doing at the center would be a good idea. I should say that Dustin has these slides. My contact information is in the slides, so you can reach out to me and they will be available to you. And maybe a bunch of folks on the call don't know that Pew Research self-defines as a fact tank. We don't do what tanks do. We are not advocates for policy solutions to anything. We don't recommend how to solve the problems that we try to illuminate with our data. We are in the business of creating what we hope is useful data for people like you who are discussing big issues of our time, but I'm not funded to be a cheerleader for the internet or any kind of digital technology. We are not promoting specific privacy policies or any policies related to net neutrality or things like that. So it's a sort of an interesting way to approach the world. I used to be a journalist, so it's a very comfortable way to approach the world. And what I'll be reporting on today are a series of major findings in a variety of areas that the Pew Research Center studies, starting with technology, but we do a lot of work, of course, related to politics, demographic change in the culture, religious activity that's going on in the culture, and I'll be running down a variety of things. There are some logical breakpoints in my presentation, and I will be pausing there to take your questions. Dustin's going to sort of feed me the ones that he sees, and I'll be really excited to do that. And I hope it'll feel a little bit more interactive that way, rather than me talking for a long time and then trying to cram in questions at the end. So I thought I'd start with just a rundown of the basic problems that we have been measuring as recently as a week or so ago. This is the state of play for the entire nation. Again, these are representative poll results that of all adults in the United States, every age group, every demographic group, every community type group, urban residents, rural residents, suburban residents, representative of socioeconomic classes, representative of different political groups. So these are when I give you a statistic here, it's representative of all adults in the United States, or in some cases, I'll just be talking about technology users. But when we have our unit has gone out and looked at the sort of mood of the country now, things are in really rough shape. People are angry, they are fearful, they are not as hopeful as they once were, and they're certainly not as proud as they were, even relatively recently. We, like a lot of polling organizations, also look at sort of general satisfaction and dissatisfaction with the way the country is going, and you can see that in the first quarter of the year, things took a nosedive, where now almost unprecedented numbers of people are dissatisfied with the direction of the country, and a very few are satisfied. One of the striking things in a lot of our data, of course, is that there are partisan and clearly polarized differences in the way that people see the world, the way they're reacting to the pandemic, the way they're thinking about how the future will unfold. So this is just one example of several that I'll be giving throughout this presentation. Just it shows that people are seeing the world in quite different ways. We asked, do you think the problems this country are facing, the worst is over or the worst is yet to come? And the differences just between April and June are pretty evident in this survey. Republicans are more likely now to say that the worst is behind us compared to where they were at the dawn of the pandemic. Overall, the general public is fairly fretful still, although they are more people now than in April were saying the worst is behind us. then we're, just behaviors in this environment have been so interestingly different depending on where people, who people are, and particularly on their political point of view. So we've been asking in recent surveys, this one was done in late May, we were asking, about how people were dealing with masks and whether they themselves are going into stores wearing masks most or all of the time or some of the time. And you can see that most people are wearing masks at least some of the time. But there are differences between Republicans and the independents who lean towards the Republican Party, and Democrats and those who lean towards the Democratic Party. Democrats and their fellow travelers are more likely to say they have been wearing masks. And we also asked folks, should masks be worn? Democrats are much more likely than Republicans to say that should always be the case. And it's just, there are ways now that even simple behaviors like protecting yourself and the people around you in the midst of a pandemic now is inflected, at least to some degree, by people's partisan differences. On the specific case of how presidential approval ratings, Pew, like a bunch of other Pew organizations, has found that the approval for the president is down a bit since the pandemic began. And that's even true among Republicans, although they are far more likely, of course, than Democrats to say that they approve of the president's handling of his office. We did, in the most recent survey in early June, ask about vote preference at this stage of the election campaign. These are very fluid numbers, of course, as the campaign unfolds. But right now, our numbers, like a bunch of other numbers around the country, are that the voters who are voting for Biden are likely to vote for Biden outnumber the voters who are likely to vote for Trump. There's a bit of a gender gap there, as there has been for a while. There, of course, is major differences by race and ethnicity. There are major differences by age. And one of the striking things that's happened in politics in recent years is that those with higher level educations have tended to drift towards the Democratic Party, and those without college educations have been more likely to consider themselves Republicans. And so these are our latest numbers, and they're sort of similar to what you've been seeing probably with a lot of other polling about what's going on in the election campaign itself. But one of the special things that we've done probably is new to some of my IGF-USA friends. In recent years, we have begun to do almost all of our polling on a panel rather than by phone. And these results, one of the things that you can do when you are talking to the same people at different points in time is you can watch their own changed behavior rather than just measuring sort of general social behavior when you're doing cross-sectional surveys that are one-shot surveys at a point in time on the telephone. So as we've watched over recent months, the approval rating for Trump, they're about 8%, so almost a tenth of voters. Began the pandemic approving of Trump, but have now changed to disapproving of his behavior. And we have enough sample of that to break that down to show that there are the people who are moving away from approving of Trump's behavior have certain characteristics. They're more likely to be younger. You can see that those who are ages 18 to 29 have moved pretty dramatically, and those between ages 30 and 49 also are disapproving, but their numbers are pretty similar to the ones that we captured in March compared to the numbers we got in June. People who live in lower income households are also much more likely now to disapprove of the president's job performance. And one of the things that we've been able to do in this panel is, since we know where the panelists live, is to add some information about the high impact counties, places where COVID cases and death rates have been particularly high, and we identify high impact counties, medium impact counties, and low impact counties. And the approval for the president has dropped considerably in places where COVID impact has been relatively high. And that, interestingly, that's across the board. I mean, Republicans in those counties are more likely, Republicans to the country, to be questioning the president's nowadays. Question about what's going on with religiously active people, and so this is just a voter preference question. You can see that white evangelical Protestants are still largely in favor and largely likely to vote for President Trump. But there are differences by religion, and there has been a bit of a drop off in support. Nothing like a collapse or a major drop, but some religiously affiliated Republicans are less keen on the president's performance and saying that they are somewhat less likely to vote for him. Although again, the numbers are quite high in this area. And just to sort of end this section about sort of the general state of the country, one of the potentially sort of counterintuitive things that we've seen in some recent data of ours, sort of a mid-June survey, is we ask a question about how hopeful people are for the future. And what we have found is that Black Americans and Hispanics are more likely to feel a lot better about the prospects for the future than they did a year ago in September 2019. And this is again one survey, so we won't have a super long trend on this. We don't have a lot of data points on this, but it's potentially a couple of things might be going on. First, things are so bad now that people are thinking they will be better in the future. At least some groups will be thinking they'll be better in the future. The other thing is that it might be related to what people are seeing in the social justice protests after George Floyd's killing. It might be the case. The survey was done about a month after the killing and after the protests began, and it might be that for Black Americans and others who are supporting those protesters, that they are feeling like that we might have reached a sort of moment in the culture where things might be turning around, and the future is looking up in ways that it wasn't in September 2019. So this is a good moment to sort of break off my presentation and begin to hear if you have any questions about the general mood of things that I just presented.
So Lee, I see one question in the chat so far, and it was asked by Judith. So Judith, I'll ask you to unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask the question.
Sure, this is Judith Hallerstein. I was just wondering whether your data rates on wearing masks have changed in the last few weeks, as many of the countries that had opened up have now found that they rates are climbing, and some are even now mandating masks. And I'm wondering if you have looked at that in the new data, or when was this data taken that you snapshotted? Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's a great and rarely relevant question. We are going to re-ask that question in the not distant future, but the data I showed are the most recent data that we had, and it would of course be fascinating to see whether people have changed their views and even more directly and powerfully changed their behaviors in light of what they're seeing about what's going on in the country right now. But these data were taken before sort of the big spikes began to occur in the South and Southwest, and we'll just have to wait and see how that changes. But one of the challenges of being in the field doing a lot of polling now, we've increased the amount of polling we're doing almost by 50% based on the research agenda we'd outlined before the pandemic began. And there are so many things going on. I mean, there's a health crisis, there's an economic crisis, there are now political questions as we get closer to the election. There are also questions about the social justice protests, and fitting this all into surveys that are we keep feeding back to this panel. There are a lot of things going on. So we're going to get back to that mass question relatively soon, but we haven't we haven't updated it to see whether the newest spike in cases really around the globe has had an effect on how people are thinking and acting.
Thanks, Lee. And it looks like we have one more
Sure.
question, and so I'm just going to allow Todd Peterson to please ask your question and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Todd. You brought up, from what you said, a question that I had. How far are your polls, and maybe polls in general, how far do they lag, the results lag behind the current time?
The news, yeah. Great, it's a great question. In the phone polling era of certainly 5 or 6 years ago and beyond that, back in the past, a very standard practice for polling organizations was to plan to be in the field towards the end of a given week, end their survey on a Sunday, so maybe poll from a Wednesday to a Sunday or a Thursday to a Sunday, and be set up to write off the poll findings for a couple of days into the next week. So maybe Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday of the following week, you'd have results about things, public attitudes towards the things that were happening 7 or 8 days before. When you're doing it on a panel like ours, it's a little bit harder to turn around material. We've gotten a lot faster in this season, in part because we want to be on top of the news as much as we possibly can be. But there's still roughly a 3 to 4 week lag time between the data collected, getting the questionnaire wrapped up, and getting data back that we can report on. So I think the fastest we've turned around material is maybe 10 or 11 days on some very straightforward and questions right after the protests began. We were able to get some findings and report on them just about 7 or 8 days after the events occurred. But there is more of a lag time now, and at least in our polling, and in some of the other organizations' polling too. I should speak up for one other thing that we're doing that might interest any number of you who are listening. For the very first time in Pew's history, we have devoted substantial funding to understanding sort of the media environment that people live in, and the context of, it was going to be the context of election 2020. Now it's the context of a pandemic and an economic crisis and social justice protests. But we had regularly scheduled polls in a way we never had before in looking at the media diets that people have, what their main news sources are, how often they consult those sources, what kinds of information they're learning on the sources, and then marrying up that information with factual knowledge, what's going on in the world and how do they understand it. And now we're adding questions about fake news and spoofs and other scams and conspiracy theories. So we're gathering up a lot of not real-time information, but pretty darn close to real-time information about the way the media environment is affecting the way people sort of see the world and react to the world and actually contribute to the world, especially when you're looking at their social media behavior. It's called, if you do a search query on it, you look under the word pathways and Pew, and you will, one of the newest things that we're doing is that we're releasing these data almost as quickly as we gather them. So we're allowing citizen journalists and citizen analysts to look at our data and report on it themselves. We're inviting people to scoop us, basically. We have tools for analyzing the data that do simple stuff like looking at Republicans versus Democrats or looking at different age groups and things. But the data themselves are available for people who want to do some of their own statistical work. And it's a really ambitious effort that just coincides with this crazy intense season about how people are consuming information, how they're making meaning out of the stories that they're seeing, how they are sort of even finding their way to the truth or finding their way to untruths in this environment. So I would just commend that to you as a set of tools that I know a bunch of geeks in the IGF world would probably really enjoy playing around with and gaining insight off of. I mean, really reporting to your networks about what's going on. Should I move on to the next stuff?
Yeah, I think so, Lee.
Okay, good. Well, here's a directly relevant IGF stuff. We, in the earliest moments of the pandemic and the shutdown, we, like everybody else in the world, saw this great turn to the internet to accomplish, both at the professional level, the practical level, the commercial level, the social level, all of the things that people had normally been thinking about doing face-to-face or with other kinds of communications technologies. And so we began to think that we might pick up, we never asked a question like this before, but we basically asked people, how is the internet now essential to you? And we got 53% of adults in the country said, yes, it's essential. 34%, so another third, said it's important but not essential. And 13% said not too important and not important at all. So in a way, it's a meaningful number. I actually thought the number might be a bit higher than 53%, in part because all the people in my network, of course, everybody I could observe, was doing stuff like what we're doing now. They turned their meetings into virtual experiences. They turned their social activities into virtual experiences. They turned a lot of their social interactions into social experiences. But there clearly is a portion of the population that either doesn't have the option to do that or doesn't live a life where that's terribly easy to do. And so when you look at the demographic breakdown of the people who said it was essential and compare it to who said it was important, who said not at all, there are pretty big differences. And some of them are very familiar to people who have watched the adoption of the internet and other technologies. Young folks, particularly those under 50, are particularly likely to say the internet has been essential. Hispanic Americans are really sort of a unique outlier group in a lot of ways that you're going to see in these data. They, more than Black Americans or whites, say the internet has been essential. Part of that has to be that Hispanics are more likely to work in essential jobs that are face-to-face jobs, that you have to physically show up at the workplace, you have to physically go places to accomplish the things that you're being paid for and things like that. But navigating those spaces and having the internet enable you to move around those spaces and maybe avoid some of the more dangerous places. There are ways that we looked at these numbers and didn't expect to see them. The Hispanic numbers were so striking and consistent in ways that you'll see otherwise too, that it was a really kind of new story to us. Upper income folks who live in upper income households are more likely to say the internet's essential. Those with higher levels of education, those in suburban and urban areas. And there's a democratic effect here, which I don't think has anything to do with politics or partisanship as much as it has to do with the kind of people who want to identify as Democrats or leaning toward Democrats just fall into the same groups as those people who are relatively heavy internet users, relatively heavily reliant people, relatively likely to be the people who are treating the internet as an essential resource in their lives. A sort of logical question to ask to follow up that question, well, if the internet's essential and important to lots of folks, well, what do you think about, at least during the pandemic outbreak, what about the government providing high-speed internet connections to people at home? And what about providing cell phone services at home? And there is not majority support for this, even in the context of this crisis. There are significant shares of Americans who think that broadband internet and cell service are vital tools for lots of people coping with the pandemic. But it's much more likely to be the case that people say the government doesn't have a responsibility to provide these tools, even though in their own lives a lot of people think these tools are essential. Another dimension of the digital divide that we've paid attention to over the years, and we asked some new questions about, as close to 100% of children were sent home from their schools to continue their educations at home. We asked about homework gap stressors, and so we asked it in three ways. So about 29% of parents whose children are at home said that they think that their children will have to do their schoolwork will struggle because they have to do their schoolwork on a cell phone. Lower income families are more likely to say that. Urban and rural families are more likely to say that. But these are the lack of a a desktop or a laptop or a bigger screen, even like a tablet computer at home, is going to be a hindrance to about 3 in 10 parents whose children go to school. About a fifth of parents with children at home say that they think their kids will have to use public Wi-Fi to finish their schoolwork because there's not a reliable internet connection at home. Again, lower income families are much more likely to say that will be an obstacle to them and their children, and rural and urban residents are also more likely to say that. And again, about a fifth say that they think their child will have to complete their schoolwork, will not be able to complete their schoolwork because they do not have access to a computer at home. So there are big, significant chunks of the population who can pretty clearly identify the ways that there are disadvantages for their kids at home. And we haven't done a specific surveying about the number of children at home recently, but everything you hear and see online is that parents who have multiple children competing for the limited number of devices in the house and maybe the limited connectivity that's available in the house. There are a lot of stressed parents in this culture thinking about the deficits their children have for lack of either hardware or connectivity in the midst of this school stuff. So again, we followed that up, knowing that people are struggling, a share of people are struggling. We asked about whether schools should provide students with tablet computers or laptops to complete their schoolwork, and there's more public support for that. So a portion of people, about 37% said of all age parents with students, said that all students should get a laptop or a tablet computer from the school system. Democrats are more likely to say that than Republicans. But at equal shares of almost all those groups say that it would be fine by them if schools spent the money to get laptops and tablet computers and provide them for students whose families cannot afford it. There are some people who say schools shouldn't be in the business of providing that kind of hardware and connectivity to students, but it was striking to see that in some respects, children are top of mind concern that a lot of people in the culture have for sort of surviving and learning in an environment that's a high stress environment. We also asked a question about just generally their students falling behind, and about 2/3 of parents, almost 64%, said they were somewhat or very worried that this would happen to their kids. But then when we asked if they were satisfied with the way their children's school was handling instruction, a lot of people were pretty happy. 83% of those parents with kids at home were saying that they were satisfied, at least somewhat, with the instruction their kids were getting. And then 77% said they received online instruction. And they were also, of course, doing a lot of the instruction related to themselves. So there are families now that are sort of coping with this new environment. And it's obviously, based on events in the past 48 hours, it's going to be a flashpoint for the fall about what happens to schools and how schools make provision for the children who are not able to be at school or if the schools are entirely shut down. And just to round off the circle about what's been going on in the internet, just a lot of the activity that used to be in-person activity is now switched to online activity. But we were struck by at least a couple of the things that were relatively new in the environment. So about a third of adults have now had a virtual party or social encounter with their buddies online, or about a fifth have watched a concert or a play that was streamed through the internet. And about a fifth participated in online fitness classes and workouts. Again, sort of young people stand out. Hispanics, again, sort of sit in an interesting way at the far end of the active users of the internet for those purposes. Relatively high education folks feel that way. And again, rural folks are the least likely to have been doing those things. We also asked about some food-related services that have grown to prominence or become more essential to people. And again, there are some differences by demographics of people who have ordered food online or people who have ordered groceries online. These are sort of April data, and I bet you these numbers have gone up since then. So again, it's a rolling story, and it fits into the wider story about how the internet has become a lifeline for a significant number of people. Again, here's another good breakpoint, Dustin. Are there any particular questions about the internet activities I was going through?
Yeah, I see a few questions in the chat. I think a few of them are old. One is just asking if portions of this can be presented to other interested parties in government and local spending priorities. And I believe you've expressed that we're welcome to share this data and the presentation with others. So we'll make that available on the event page for this on the IGF-USA website, if that's all right, Lee. And,
absolutely. Yep.
And then that can be sent around to anybody. I do see 2 hands, so since we don't have any questions in the chat, why don't we go to those 2 hands? I see Steve Del Bianco has a hand up, so I will enable him to talk. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Steve.
Hey, Lee, thanks for doing this, and thanks for being such a big supporter of IGF-USA. Lee, I was so saddened with the data on how many lower income people did not have what they consider to be usable internet access. And I've never seen a teenager of any income level who didn't have a smartphone or a mobile phone with some level of internet access. So my question would be, did you ask any questions to ascertain whether the respondents had mobile phone with or without internet, and use that to fact check their response to the question that they didn't have adequate internet access? Because I have the impression that many cell phone plans for smartphones allow a hotspot so that if that home had a computer, they at least would have the ability to get online. But it could be that I'm just sadly mistaken and living in an ivory tower. But help me understand whether the apparent use of smartphones with internet access, how does that match up with the responses you got on their inability to have internet? Thank you.
Well, if you look at the questions we were asking, it was not. There were, the Wi-Fi question was definitely about the consistency and availability of access. We didn't do the kind of fact checking that you're talking about, but we did sort of cross-analyze this with other data that we were gathering at the time about people struggling to pay their bills, partly their broadband or their cell plan, their data plans, but also just generally for food and shelter and things like that. And what was clearly becoming evident in April as the unemployment was spiking was that even people who had those devices weren't necessarily in good shape to keep paying for them. And so that's part of the story that's going on here. The other thing that's clearly implied in this first question on the left here is that we did presume that lots of kids have smartphones. It's not necessarily elementary age kids. They tend to borrow their parents' phones, or at least until they're up to about age 9 or 10. But doing your homework on a smartphone is just a little bit of a struggle for a lot of families. We know that from previous data. About 17% of adults in the United States are cell dependent or smartphone dependent. They don't have broadband at home, and they do a lot, and they say their smartphone serves a lot of purposes for them, but their smartphone isn't necessarily the optimal way for them to write a report or study a website or file a job application or things like that. So there are ways in which the smartphone isn't a sufficient substitute for a bigger screen and solid broadband connectivity for lots of folks. And there are people who don't have computers at home, and so that the smartphone becomes the typing device for whatever assignments they have to hand in. So yes, you're right. There are lots of people have cell phones. Lots of families sort of share their instruments, so kids don't necessarily have access to them all the time that they want them. And so the struggle, is pretty evident, at least in these kinds of very practical questions about getting their schoolwork done. I hope that's responsive to you.
Thank you, Lee.
Thanks, Lee. And then there was one more hand, and then we've since had a question come in. So let's go to the hand first.
Okay.
Oops. So, Shiva, are you on and able to talk? Okay, so while we wait for that,
sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Siva Subramanian. I'm from a different geography from India, affiliated with Internet Society India, Chennai. And Lee's research is very elaborate and it is thorough. And but what surprises me is that there is a recurrent mention of Republican, Democrat, black, white, Hispanic. While that makes a lot of sense to understand where the problem lies, in the internet governance context, isn't it wise to see the president as the president, not as a Republican president or a Democratic president, a congressman as a congressman, not as a Republican congressman or a Democratic congressman? Isn't it wiser to steer clear of politics, and isn't it wiser to stay away from making distinctions? Just a thought. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There are 10 research units at the Pew Research Center. My unit that focuses on internet and technology is one of the 10. There is a unit that studies politics specifically, and then a variety of other units. Over the years, that unit that studies politics has been among the trailblazers in showing that political polarization, especially in the United States, is a deep, broad, powerful determinant of how people see the world and act in the world. And it's gotten to the point now where it affects people's judgments about other human beings. It's not just a difference over policy. The way that Americans often see this now is it's a difference over good and evil, a difference over who's a worthy person and who's not, a difference over who has ideas that will help our country compared with people who have ideas that will destroy our country. And the thing that's accompanied that polarization is that people's partisanship now is a stronger predictor of how people see the world and act in the world on many, many issues, both political issues, technology-related issues, on social issues. People's partisan identification and their identity and partisanship is a major determinant of how they see the world. It's how they judge information. It's how they decide who to be a friend. It affects how they literally see people who don't agree with them. So it's a persistent story in our data. That's why I presented it particularly in that top material, because I was talking about politics, and it was, broadly in the context of a presidential election campaign that's going on right at the moment now. But these are differences that began to emerge maybe 15 years ago, have intensified over recent years, and are a pretty important explainer about why the world differentiates itself the way that it does. It used to be in social science, if you knew somebody's level of education, or if you knew their gender, or if you knew their age, you could predict with high probability who they are and what they did. Now those factors pale in comparison to people's partisan identities as explainers and indicators of who they are and how they behave.
Thanks, Lee. And we have so there was one more question in the Q&A here about whether or not there is any sentiment on whether broadband should be a utility given the data about the government providing broadband.
We've asked a version of that in the past, not at the current moment. We asked that essential question as essentially a proxy for people's thinking about that, and then the follow-up question about whether the government should take responsibility in providing broadband and sell data plans. so when we've asked it in the past, and we've asked this actually in a variety of places around the world, it's not just the United States, people are comfortable saying that internet access ought to be a human right. Not everybody says that, but significant portions of people sort of in a whole lot of places around the world are comfortable with that idea. But then when you say, should government provide it, and compared with other priorities, where should it stand in the funding that governments make towards other kinds of policy priorities, like social services, like law enforcement, like schools, like national defense and things like that? People sort of drop off, or a share of people drop off and sort of say, yes, internet connectivity would be nice to have, but isn't necessarily at the top of my priority list. So there are gradations to that question.
Thanks, Lee. And just a reminder that if you do want questions answered, to post them in the Q&A. But I did see one question in the chat about whether or not there's any idea of how many schools require VPN access for classes. And if you don't have anything on that, or after this question, let's move on to the privacy section.
I would suggest you might check with Common Sense Media, which does a lot of research around children and technology. They might have data on that. I have never actually seen anything like that. VPNs at schools. Should I keep going now?
Yep. Let's roll into privacy.
Okay, a perennial favorite at IGF. So before the pandemic, we did a major piece of work on privacy and surveillance and where the public stands on it. And I stick a link at the bottom of this slide that you can get access to about a 90-page report if you want to go in depth into our data. The sort of strong takeaway was that people, no matter what you ask about, whether it's companies collecting data or the government collecting data, people don't feel control over what's happening. They're concerned about what's happening, particularly when companies are harvesting the data. They do not feel they understand what's being done with the data once it's harvested. And when you ask them a very broad question, basically, do the benefits you get out of data collection outweigh the risks, or the risks outweigh the benefits? They're pretty strongly inclined to say the risks outweigh the benefits. So it's a portrait of sort of an ecosystem of data collection that people struggle in the midst of, are not happy with the way it's unfolding, and are feeling pretty impotent when it comes to addressing some of these issues in their lives. In the particular context of the coronavirus outbreak, we asked about what this was a question we asked when the surveillance or the tracking apps on smartphones were being discussed, when Apple and Google were putting together an app, and some states were building their own apps. And most Americans, the majority of Americans, don't think location tracking through cell phones will make a difference in the spread of COVID-19. Again, you'll see that Hispanics are more likely to think it will help than some other groups, those who have relatively high levels of education. There's a little bit of a partisan cast to it as well. Democrats and independents are more likely to say it would help at least a little bit in doing it. But it was so striking to see that one of the first tools that was proposed for tracking people with a coronavirus, with infections, or who might have been possibly infected, even though it was a strategy that was well underway in the Asian countries that were experiencing outbreaks, Americans were not thrilled with the idea, didn't think it was going to have much efficacy. Then we asked them more specifically about the kinds of trade-offs that would potentially occur in this. And so we asked about the government using people's cell phones to track the location of those who had tested positive for the coronavirus, in order to understand how the virus may be spreading. That's a very typical breakout of people's answers. They're not unalterably opposed. Not 100% of people think it's the worst idea in the world, but not 100% think it's the best idea either. There's a 50-50 break about whether it's an acceptable or unacceptable thing to do, and that's often the way that Americans think about the trade-offs that they are offered when data are collected. It's usually not. It's not never a blind thing. They're sort of, we offer you this product, service, bit of security in return for your sharing with us your data or letting us harvest your data. And these 50-50 verdicts are just quite common when the conditions of surveillance and the conditions of data gathering are put into a broader context. By the same token, it's kind of a split verdict when we ask, is it acceptable or unacceptable to use tracking data for those who have had contact with someone who tested positive. So again, it's not; those aren't big statistical differences, and Americans are sort of divided on that. But then, if enforcement comes into play, is it acceptable or unacceptable for the government to use people's cell phone data to track people to ensure that they are complying with experts' advice on limiting social contact during the coronavirus outbreak? We didn't explain that might mean quarantining, or that might mean social distancing, or that might mean wearing a mask or anything. It was just a general question that something would be done if somebody with an infection was asked to. Was in play, and people were not happy with that trade-off. By 62% to 37%, they said it was unacceptable. Again, sort of there are demographic differences by each of those questions that I just outlined. Again, Hispanics are across the board more likely to think each of those things is acceptable. It might come from the fact that that population has been on the front lines as essential workers and seeing high rates of infection and relatively high rates of death. It might be that it's sort of they're saying, we hope something is going to be done, and location tracking might be one of the array of solutions that are available in this. And there are, again, sort of more partisan differences. Democrats and the independents who lead, the Democrats themselves are a little bit more likely to say things are acceptable than Republicans are, and independents sort of sit between those two groups. Then we've been studying techlash and tech-related issues in the pre-pandemic period. We have not asked this. We're asking questions about tech companies in a survey that's in the field right now. So Dustin, you can have me back in about 2 months to talk about what we've learned about tech companies and the public understanding of them in the midst of the coronavirus outbreak. But I wanted to share these slides with you just because they were so striking to us. Our politics unit, even before 2010, would ask a battery of questions about a variety of institutions and their impact on the way things are going in the country. And it's about political parties, and it's about certain kinds of institutions and companies and things like that. And for a long time, even as other organizations and other groups sort of saw their fortunes rise and fall, sometimes the public thought they were doing right by the country, sometimes they thought they were having a negative impact on the country. The one sort of steady state thing was, the technology companies were seen in a relatively positive light, and that dropped off very dramatically in about 2017, 2018, and the public is not convinced anymore. And it's across the board. Interestingly, in the chart on the right here, you'll see that Democrats and Republicans don't look too different on that score. There's a bit of a partisan difference. The Democrats are a little bit more likely to say the companies have a positive effect on the country, but it's still, the collapse was the striking thing there, and the collapse really applied to partisans in both camps. And finally, in the context of the election itself, most people say to us, and we've tested this now in September 2018 as well as January 2020. So it was before the pandemic broke out, but they are not as likely to have confidence in tech companies to prevent misuse of their platforms in the election as they are to have confidence. There are a lot more people who are concerned about the role of technology companies, particularly in preventing the misuse of their platforms to influence the election. And it's a pretty striking way that the public is quite concerned about what they see happening online. And it's a pretty striking governance issue for the folks who are in IGF. So that's the end of the sort of technology specific part of my presentation, and we can go to questions again if there are any, Dustin.
Yeah, there are. So we officially got our first use of the upvote feature. So
yay.
We will go to Robert Guerra for his question, and I have enabled you to talk, so you can go ahead and unmute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that great presentation. I think something, I guess, which is a bit of a challenge in the US now because of the high numbers of COVID, but in your presentation just now, there's a subtle but important difference between tracking and contact tracing. And I think, I think it's important I would like to get your thoughts on if people understand the difference, specifically what contact tracing is about. And, because I think once things are a bit better under control, but before we have a vaccine, it's really important to try to contain the outbreaks and, having a sense of what people need to hear from public health officials and others to be able to adopt technology. Because if people are resistant, it's like vaccines, they just won't use it and it'll be a problem. And so I'm just curious if there's, any factors that you've done in this study or others that would be helpful for those wanting some of these technologies, regardless of how well they're implemented, but that would be useful for the communications piece of it. Thank you.
Yeah, what a really smart observation and question. So the stuff that I've presented here was related just to the tracking piece of this, because the rise of these potential apps was a new dimension, really, to the way that disease surveillance was being considered. And so we felt, as the sort of technology unit in a research firm, we should pay a lot of attention to that. And it got more coverage and attention in the early days of the outbreak than contact tracing. As luck would have it, we are in the field right now with a survey about contact tracing that I think is going to answer some of the issues that either you directly raised or implied in your question. So, for instance, we just don't know what the compliance level might look like. We've asked people, and I'll show you a slide later on, about 27% of adults say that if a vaccine became available, they would not take it. And so in the spirit of contact tracing, we asked, well, would you pick up your phone if somebody called you? And it was a number that was tied to a state or local health authority. Would you pick up the phone? And we don't know what the answer is yet, but we're going into it with a sense that at least a share of the population will say no. I mean, the standard behavior for lots of people now, when a mystery number pops up on their screen, is not to answer it. Then we asked, well, if you got a voicemail, you didn't answer the phone, but you got a voicemail with somebody identifying themselves as a contact tracer for a public agency, would you respond to it? And would you answer your door if somebody knocked on your door and said, I'm from a local health agency, and we've been notified that you might have been in contact with somebody with the coronavirus? And so we don't know the answers to that yet, but I think there's a I think we're going to find that at least a share of the population starts with this wariness that we picked up in the pre-COVID privacy work that we were doing. They're just uncertain about the system. They don't know what's going on. They instinctively are not happy with being, particularly around health information and maybe even their friends, who their friends are and who they've been with and things. We don't know how big that share is. It might be kind of minuscule, but we think folks like that are out there, and part of what their judgment is informed by their wariness tied to this privacy stuff that we were talking about, that I was talking about at the very top of this presentation.
Just a quick follow-up. Keen to follow up with you. I think one of the challenges is for any of these initiatives that are really to help public health is if people think that the silos between confidential data, whether in regards to public health or medicine, are broken and it's shared with the government and people have a distrust of government, then there's a big problem. And so measuring the trust and perhaps how that can be built back up afterwards, I think are going to be key.
Yeah, one of the things we did see in that previous pre-COVID work was that in interesting ways, especially when you invite people to talk about this in open-ended answers, some can distinguish between what worries them about the government as distinct from what worries them about companies. A lot of people see them now as undifferentiated, that companies themselves are sharing their data with the government, or the government can access it in one way, shape, or form. And the other thing that's on their minds that's quite related to this is no matter how much they trust the entity that's collecting the data in the first place, they've signed off on the terms and conditions of the exchange, they worry about hacking. So they worry about data breaches as now part of the puzzle that they have to worry about. And again, sort of they score different kinds of information with different weights of sensitivity, and health information in particular is pretty precious to people, right up there with their finances and their children's lives as the things that they are most anxious about protecting.
Thanks, Lee. I'm going to go to an additional question now that was upvoted. That one is from Sam Jadali. So Sam, you're now able to talk if you unmute yourself.
Hi, Lee. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dustin. Thank you for all the insightful information, Lee. I really appreciate it. A quick question. I guess since the arrival of the GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act, these laws, they state, we have to pseudonymize, companies have to pseudonymize a lot of their data. Are there any statistics that detail how much of the shared data that's going on between companies and third parties, how much of that is sensitive data? I was curious if there's any development or stats on that.
I would bet you somebody has it. We haven't really tracked that. And the other thing that is part of the picture, though, is that, and we've done this in previous privacy work, and people are very nuanced in how they think about what's sensitive and what's okay with them. They're fine with the wider world knowing their music preferences, even their politics, and most of the time their media preferences and things like that. They don't want health and children's stuff and financial stuff. But the sort of newer reality that people have a vague sense is worrisome is the aggregation of even small bits of what they would consider to be inconsequential information if it was freestanding. In other words, it's the accretion of the portrait of me that is disclosed in my data, even my likes, my shares, my comments in social media and stuff like that. People are now sort of tuned in to the idea, in the general sense, they're being profiled in ways that they don't quite grasp, but they think they can be manipulated, and that's what worries them. And they think that part of this is because so much is known about them that is, even small bore stuff eventually has some meaning, and people can build understanding of them around it.
Thank you, Lee.
Thanks, Lee. So we have a few more questions, and I think since this is the tech specific, if we could just spend a little bit more time here before going on, if that's all right.
Sure.
So what I will do here is I see that Steve, you had a hand up. Is that still an active hand, or is that old?
Old hand, thank you.
Okay. And then the last question was from an earlier segment, and that one is also from Robert. So Robert, if you'd still like to ask that, I've left you with ability to unmute.
Sure, let me just get back to it. So the earlier, before this segment was particularly great, but I'm just wondering if either in this study or others, they're being compared to what other populations outside the US are what's being seen in other countries and how that compares, and just to see if there's any factors that are driving some of the polling results, whether they're political or whether they're just other issues.
Yeah. Yes, I wish we could afford it, and that there are specific challenges that have just been difficult for us in our global polling. So another one of the research units is a unit that does polling around the world. In a normal year, they do similar surveys in between 40 and 50 countries. A portion of their surveys are about technology, and so we've got a rich trove of data about who uses it and maybe some of the benefits they get out of it. Since most of the polling around the world is done face-to-face, we canceled a lot of our 2020 polling because we didn't want to put our field workers or our respondents in harm's way. So we've scaled back to places where phone polling is, it can be done. It's a pretty sophisticated system, and you need to have a very sophisticated partner in a country to pull it off, but you can do it. And so I think in 14 or 15 countries, we're doing surveys right now that will be released, I'm going to say mid to late fall. About a lot of it is geopolitics, and how are people getting along, and what do they think about the United States, and what do they think about China, and that kind of stuff. But a lot of it is now going to focus on what their responses have been to the pandemic. These will be mostly developed societies, so we're not going to get a good reading on the global South. But so stay tuned in the fall, basically.
Thanks, Lee. And then we had one hand go up, so I want to give Jeremy Pesner an opportunity to ask a question, and Jeremy should be able to unmute now.
Thanks, Dustin. I just had a really quick question about sort of how the cross sections of who you profiled and what you paid attention to. We're going back a ways, but talking about, for example, do people feel they have sufficient internet access? That would be useful to cross-reference against their income and location in terms of whether they feel they can afford it, whether internet is available, or some combination of the two. So just to map it against not only, I suppose, race or political preference, but socioeconomic status and location.
Yeah, and we've got a lot of data on that that confirm the point that you're making, that socioeconomic status is an enormous determinant of technology adoption, technology literacy, people feeling comfortable with the gadgetry and using the systems. And so yes, the correlates are exactly what you'd expect too. Richer people are happy and content and have access, and poorer people are struggling in ways that you would expect.
Yes. So just to, so that makes sense. So the question is it largely, I guess the question would be, is it largely economics? Is it largely location? Trying to get a sense of how each of these factors, what the degree of weight is on each of these.
The most recent work we did in the United States. So we don't do elaborate work around the world on this, but in 2019, we ask a lot, why do you don't use technology? Over time, it's about 10% of American adults don't use the internet. 26% don't have broadband at home, and the cost has risen as a factor as the share of the population using broadband has grown, or using the internet has grown. So the people who don't use it or struggle with it are more likely now to cite cost as the factor than any other single thing. But there are still people who, when you first ask the question, will say, I just am scared of it, or I like the technology I already have, or I have heard horror stories about how this invites predators and thieves and harassers into your life, and I don't want that. They tend to be a bit older, and so there's a feeling about tech competency, tech literacy that also is an inhibitor.
Thanks, Lee. So I see that we are about 17 minutes out, and based on the run of show, that gives us about 10 minutes would probably be good to cover this last part. I'm sure we won't get through everything, of course, but you guys have endless data, so that's to be expected. And
yeah, I overloaded with slides, just not knowing, what would be interesting to people. So this is sort of part 2 of the politics stuff that my colleagues in the politics unit have done. And in a way, this is a technology slide. I mean, Americans are not confident the election is going to go off in a calm, cool, and collected way. A lot. We asked, will the coronavirus outbreak significantly disrupt Americans' ability to vote in the election in December? And 2/3 said yes. And Democrats are more likely than Republicans, but even half of Republicans are worried about that possibility. We asked questions about, was our country's initial response to the pandemic, was the president's way he was addressing it. Is the worst still to come? And 2/3 of Americans, 2/3 say he was too slow in getting off the mark. 2/3 say that states are opening too quickly, and 3/4 say that the worst is still to come. There also, there's been an interesting, again, sort of, I have to go back to partisanship. There have been partisan differences about people having a great deal of confidence in a variety of sources of information. By and large, over time, and including in the midst of the pandemic, more and more adults have a great deal of confidence in medical scientists to act in the best interest of the public. But a lot of that change, particularly over the last 2 years, has come with Democrats feeling that way, and Republicans pretty much not moving very much on that. This again sort of partially explains why there might have been different behavioral reactions to the pandemic. Republicans think the outbreak aren't as likely now to say the outbreak will be a major threat to the health of the population, as said so at the very beginning, or it said so certainly at the beginning of April, when things were at their, when the major elements of the story were coming together. Here's what Americans think are going to happen, and they would like the government, in many cases, to get directly involved with this. They either somewhat favor or strongly favor the government taking steps to prevent evictions and foreclosures. The same thing for the government providing additional tax cuts and loans to businesses to keep workers on the payroll. Also providing financial assistance to state and local governments. Extending increased unemployment benefits, although there's less support for that than some of the other things I just mentioned. And it's about a 50-50, it's a much more even verdict about temporarily cutting workers' payroll and Social Security taxes. I should have put this higher up. I'm going to just go blast through this, Dustin, because this is going to interest folks on the call because it's so related to technology. So we've asked about people's sources of information, and there are partisan differences when it comes to people trusting the CDC or their governors or the local news media or the national news media or the Trump administration. So again, sort of people are allocating their trust in different ways, partly on the basis of their partisan affiliations. A growing share of Americans, especially Republicans, say the outbreak has been exaggerated. Not much movement on the Democratic line there, but there's considerable movement on the Republican line there. About half of Americans who rely on the White House for coronavirus news. So we asked about the main sources that they're relying on, and it's those who rely on the White House are more likely than others to think the crisis has been overblown. And if you're relying on the Trump administration, you're more likely to think that than if you're relying on local news outlets or state or local officials or national news outlets. And public health organizations. This is a confusing time. And so again, in the spirit of the initiative that I described that we call Pathways, we're looking at the media diets people have. and we're sort of getting regular readings about the performance of media and stuff like that. And the confusing environment speaks up because only about a third of Americans are very confident that they can fact check news about COVID-19. So the sense that there's a confusing environment out there, that there are conflicting pieces of information about what's going on with treatments, what's going on with policies meant to mitigate the crisis, what's going on with contact tracing and things like that. This is a very good slide describing a generalized state of confusion that people have as they're confronting a very fluid media environment and fluid story. About half of Americans say they've seen made-up news about the virus, and specifically, a whole lot of people have seen, that pandemic video. This is the way we asked about it, that powerful people are intentionally planning the coronavirus outbreak. So, a share of Americans have said that they're aware of that, and about a third of those who are aware of this theory say it's probably or definitely true. So there's this sense that information wars are a natural feature of life now in the news ecosystem, and certainly a part of public life in the midst of these crises. Again, sort of going back to people who rely on the Trump administration, say the outbreak has been exaggerated. They are also struggling to find out. It's difficult to determine what's true. So they think it's been exaggerated, but they're not quite sure how to reevaluate the threat level that faces them and their communities. And that's sort of another one of the costs of having an information environment that is so up for grabs, basically. This is in the broader context of how the misinformation problem now has risen as a concern in the national culture. Half of Americans say that made-up news and information is a very big problem in the culture today. This is a question that was asked before COVID, before the social unrest and social justice protests began. But it's interesting to see that made-up news and information now is perceived by folks as being a major problem, on par with things like climate change and violent crime and the gap between the rich and the poor and the sort of way the American political system functions. We also ask people, well, if you think it's a problem, well, why? What do you think it is? And 2/3 of Americans say that made-up news is a problem because it affects. It affects the way Americans' confidence in government. If you don't have confidence in government, you don't necessarily get problems solved in a culture. That has said it affects Americans' confidence in each other when they see so much disputing information and angry information and commentary floating around the system. It hurts their confidence in each other. And it has to say it hurts political leaders' ability to get work done. So problems don't get solved because people don't agree even on what the basic facts are. And journalists aren't necessarily seen as the major culprits, but they are seen as the major answer for solving the misinformation problem. Although, again, many people now say that they don't necessarily trust mainstream news sources anymore. So that's the tech piece of it, and I bet you there are questions related to that.
Great. And since we're on a time pinch here, if there's anybody that does have a question, feel free to just throw a hand up. And I think we have time for probably one question. So whichever hand goes up first, we'll go to that question. And then if there's nothing else, then we can go back to a question which I believe is from a previous section from Romella. So why don't we go ahead and go to that, and Romella, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry, it took me a second to figure that out. So I had asked a couple of questions, so I'm not certain which question you were referring to.
The most recent one on is there support for regulation on pricing?
Yes, that's essentially the question. There was some statistics that you threw out about how people feel the internet is essential, but they're not in support of the government sort of paying for it for people. So I was wondering if there was support for regulation so that the pricing could be made more affordable. Thank you.
Yes, we haven't asked that. That's a nice policy question. Some of the problem we've had over the years in asking about specific policy things is that they are hard to describe in a survey question without sort of leading the witness. So that's just my excuse for my not being clever enough to ask a question like that. But that's a great idea for a policy question. I think. The other answer, of course, that has been commonly argued in the tech community is more competition will cut prices.
Well, thanks, Lee. I think that's about all the time that we have for questions, but we'll make those all of the resources and data available, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do this. It's been a huge help to the IGF-USA 2020, and look forward to hopefully hosting something similar in the fall when you have even more data.
Thanks so much, Dustin.
And so with that, I just want to turn it over to Melinda to give us a little bit of a preview for what to expect 2 weeks from now at the IGF-USA 2020.
Thanks, Dustin, and thanks again, Lee. As always, Pew has their fingers on the pulse of public opinion, and I really appreciate your taking time to share that with us today. Likewise, I think that the 2020 program for IGF-USA is also a reflection of the very hottest and most critical topics in front of us for internet governance. I'll begin with an obligatory reminder. Please register. We need to get your information and allow you to have the proper passwords and information. You can all find this on our website, igfusa.us. So we're trying to make the best of this virtual environment and take advantage of a few things that come with the online forum. So the first is evident in that we've expanded our program from 1 day to a 2-day event. And sorry about that. This allows us to not have any sort of concurrent sessions so that we can make each one of these topics available to the full audience in the moment. But as always, we are recording the sessions, and they'll be archived and available for later viewing. We're going to start a little later than we normally do when we're together in DC. This allows us to accommodate more panelists and viewers. While those few hours might not seem like a lot for us, and it does a little bit of a burden for our friends in Europe, it's optimized for the continental US, our primary constituency. So this allows us to bring some new voices from the West Coast and the mountain region to our panel. So I'm really excited that we have those available to us. And finally, we acknowledge the importance of networking and the informal conversations that are a part of these types of events. And so we've incorporated that into the agenda as well. So we have some semi-structured breaks between the formal sessions that will provide the attendees a chance to interact with one another, and some of the panelists will stay around and have an additional dialogue for those times. As for the program itself, we have 9 structured sessions. Again, the full agenda is on our website, but I just want to give you a few highlights here today. We start our event asking a really big question. Did America's tech industry deliver for Americans during this COVID crisis? So this team, which will include Lieutenant Governor of Ohio, John Husted, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce CEO, Suzanne Clark, and Internet pioneer Ben Cerf, are going to dissect this question with a review of several use cases and a discussion of some of the emerging trends that we think will hold as we get past this pandemic. We're then going to move into an update on 5G in the context of international security standards, security interest, in their impact on the Internet of Things. We are honored to begin the session with a fireside chat with FCC Chairman Ajit Pai. Tech news is filled with stories about pending encryption legislation, and we have a superstar encryption panel that will present 2 viewpoints on whether the government should require ISPs and apps to enable lawful access to data in transit that's currently protected by end-to-end encryption. So again, we're going to focus this on data in motion. Stored data would take a full additional session. We end our first day on another hot topic, Section 230. This team of experts from both tech companies, academia, civil society are going to look specifically at content moderation and disinformation, some of the content that some believe that tech companies should moderate. Our second day is a really strong end user focus, a lot of topics that cover the activities that impact us as users on a daily or weekly basis. We begin the day with leading privacy experts, including William Shirless and Jennifer Globeck, reviewing how privacy law quickly shifted to meet our immediate healthcare needs during the pandemic. And we're also going to have some discussion of the commencement of contact tracing efforts. In the afternoon, we have a really impressive group of experts around artificial intelligence and computer sciences who will share the latest on the AI market. Hey, Nola, you want to come join us? Nola Cat is a regular attendee of all of our planning sessions, and so she's here with us today. So the AI team is going to look at the AI market in terms of machine learning and data aggregation and their impact on business and end users. That session is followed by another session that looks at technology, specifically the threats to the infrastructure and how those threats, though not often visible to end users, really do indeed impact end users. So this panel has a very strong operational focus, including representatives from CenturyLink, Affilius, and GoDaddy, who will share the specific actions these companies take on a daily basis to make the internet safe. The penultimate panel looks at another trending topic in the news today, something that Lee touched on earlier, the impact of the pandemic had on education. So we'll look at some of those challenges of remote learning and how it really has amplified the digital divide in the United States. Our final session looks to the future, and it asks what the pandemic means for the future of internet governance. So this is going to be a very lofty discussion, and it will consider, do we need an evolution or do we need a revolution? We've got an independent group of panelists here, are not beholden to any sort of preconceived or political agenda, which will give us both candor and a big blue sky discussion, which I think is a really great way to finish out our program. We're going to close our event on day 2 with a cocktail party, where we're going to have a guest bartender. Next week, I will publish the official cocktail list, give everyone a chance to do some pre-event shopping. So we have a robust agenda, jam-packed with experts. I am looking forward to seeing all of you there. Please be certain to register in advance so that we can push some more details to you via email. And as always, you can find out the latest at IGF-USA.us.
Awesome. Thanks for that great overview, Melinda. And thank you all for joining. I'm going to launch a poll just really quickly because wanted to get a sense of how well this Q&A process worked in terms of engagement. And if you could just fill that out before you leave this room, that'd be much appreciated. And we'll follow up based on the results of this to hopefully find the best solution for engagement during the conference itself. So thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Bye, everyone.